a dozen years ago to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promote justice for all. Our primary work over the years has been fighting anti-Semitism on college campuses, doing so as lawyers, supporting students, and helping them to articulate with university administrators the problems that they're facing in ways that will resonate with the legal and moral responsibilities that they have, and where necessary, holding institutions accountable where they are responsible for tolerating anti-Semitic harassments for Jewish students. In recent years, we've expanded that work to include work in the elementary and secondary area, where sadly we found increasing problems and reports, and also most recently into the corporate sector. And I'll be joined today by my colleague Rory Lancman, former New York councilman and assemblyman, who heads our corporate initiative. Lisa Lewin, our president, is not well enough today to join us. She sends her regrets. Let me say a few words by way of framing for this. If you've been seeing the blogosphere over the last few hours, you know that the American Anti-Defamation League has just announced their most recent data on college campus. There's good news and there's bad. The good news is that BDS activity has declined, which is to say efforts on college campuses to boycott, defect from, and sanction the Jewish state have been declining. This is something we've seen. The bad news is that anti-Semitism continues to mutate, and in fact we are now seeing surging anti-Israel and anti-Semitic activity on college campuses. So a very substantial increase overall in anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activity, even at a time when the so-called BDS movement has declined. And this is not necessarily good news. The fact is, over the dozen years that the Brandeis Center has been in existence, over the 20 years that I have been following this issue and fighting anti-Semitism, we have seen changes in the way in which Jewish students on college campuses see anti-Semitism. There was a time, a decade ago, when the reports that we were getting from college campuses involved primarily kind of a toxic threat to the environment on college campuses based on anti-Israel speeches and activities that crossed a line into anti-Semitism and that were hurtful for students. In some cases, they would then lead to assaults, vandalism, and other activity. 5 years ago or so, we started to see not just this sort of general systemic or climatic problem for Jewish students, but an increase in a more targeted attack on Jewish institutions. So whether it's a Jewish student group, whether it's an outside Jewish student group, efforts to exclude them, especially from progressive spaces, efforts to shut out Jewish organizations from multi-group situations. This was, I thought, a sign that things could be getting worse, in the sense that we were not seeing only speech, we were seeing efforts to exclude. In the last couple of years or so, we've seen more targeted, in-your-face anti-Semitism, specifically directing Jewish students in a way that we haven't seen before. In this way, the shift from BDS to other forms of anti-Semitism has been, in some ways, a more direct blow to Jewish students. By way of example, at State University of New York, women who co-founded, forgive me, this is going to be blunt, co-founded a program for sexual assault survivors to engage in various forms of activism, were then thrown out of that group after it became known that they were supporters of the State of Israel. We view this not only as being a matter of individual political expression, but also, and more deeply, a matter of Jewish Americans who are open and proud about their identity being excluded from particular groups. We saw that at the University of Vermont with a book club excluding Zionist participants. We've seen that at other universities, including the University of Southern California, where one of our clients was subject to an effort to impeach her based on the perception that she was a Zionist. Similarly, at Tufts University in Massachusetts, an effort to throw one of our clients out of a student government position. So we're seeing increasingly the same toxic anti-Semitism that we've been monitoring and fighting for years Yes, some aspects are down, but on the others are up. And what we're seeing that's increasing has been some of the worst of it. Let me say a word about one. We're so glad to see you here. Since the beginning, our efforts have focused on really 4 pillars. This is, I would say, the first public event in which we are showing our new logo, which has 4 pillars. And the 4 pillars of the Brandeis Center for Human Rights under Law are research, education, advocacy, and leadership. That is to say, in our books and articles, we provide research. Some of you have copies of our fact sheets. We show the various aspects of anti-Semitism and the various ways in which it can be fought through law and public policy. In our advocacy, we represent students and others facing anti-Semitism to ensure that institutions are held accountable. And in our leadership programs, we welcome law students in as fellows and as members of our chapters of law schools. But the education component, working with public policy makers and influentials, has always been central to the work that we do. From the beginning, we've testified before Congress, before other legislative bodies. We've served as a resource. We've worked with some of you on various matters. We do not lobby, but we try to provide as best we can educational resources that can support the work that you do. We know that Congress plays a central role in addressing the efforts to fight anti-Semitism and promote equal justice for all. And you do it through a variety of ways, through legislation such as Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which crucially protects the civil rights of American college students as well as American public school students. You do it through oversight, for instance, oversight of the education department's monitoring and compliance with Title VI of the Higher Education Act, which addresses Middle East studies programs and whether they're using funding in appropriate ways. You do it through the various ways in which the bully pulpit can be exercised, and we've worked with some of your offices in doing that. I would say that now is a time that we have perhaps a greater need to work together than ever before. Based on virtually every available data set, anti-Semitism continues to grow worldwide and in the United States. It continues to grow within the United States higher education system, as today's news shows from the most recent ADL report. And it continues to expand, including incidents of violence on the streets over the last couple of years greater than ever before. There are more religiously motivated anti-Semitic acts than there are against any other single group. So that is why this is perhaps a particularly auspicious time to have this event, which we are able to have only thanks to I think the term was honorary sponsorship of Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. If she'll forgive me or permit me, I'd like to say a couple words about her. Not just sort of the basics. We know that she has been a distinguished member of Congress for many years, ranking on appropriations, influential on many issues that are of importance to the Jewish community. There's one area where I would like to express particular gratitude above and beyond for her support for the Brandeis Center in this event. I remember a number of years ago when there was first discussion of having a Jewish American Heritage Month. Now, why is it important? As you know, our fight is about anti-Semitism. It's about dealing with a kind of hate. And when people ask me what we're for, I would say we are for equal justice for all. I would say we as Americans are for civil rights compliance. But if the question is, and how do you address it beyond law, beyond compliance? I would say that there is no more important response than pride. Pride in our own identity, whoever we are. And if we are Jewish Americans, pride in our identity as Jewish Americans. And I don't think that that's been said or done enough. In the last year or two, I think more than any time I can remember, there has been a movement to recognize Jewish American Heritage Month just to the same extent as other Heritage Months have been recognized. Now, there are other people who were involved, from President George W. Bush to Senator Arlen Specter. But I remember when Congresswoman Schultz first developed this idea. She not only carried it in the House of Representatives. I don't think that there is anyone who is a more energetic or influential supporter of this. And I think on top of everything else, we should all who care about the Jewish community be thankful for this work of Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It only took 17 years. So finally, really, he put Jewish American Heritage Month on the map, and thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm so glad to be here with you, although I feel enclosed by this podium. But that's because I'm vertically challenged, and it's kind of the story of my life. But I'm really glad to see this room full, and that there is so much interest in making sure that we can combat Jew hate, combat anti-Semitism, because it is really intensified and concentrated in such a toxic stew of hate in this country that we could not have a more timely gathering, especially with the release of the President's first ever U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. Because that's going to be instrumental in tackling the record high escalation directed towards the Jewish American community. I will tell you, I grew up on Long Island in New York. You can take the girl out of New York, you can never really take the real ahead of the girl. And in a community that had a very high Jewish population, very significant Jewish population. I represent a district in South Florida, which is a lot of the transplants from the place I came from, which also has a high concentration of the Jewish community. And in growing up, I can remember one incident in my life that was directly anti-Semitic when I was in high school. One incident when I went to college that was directly overtly anti-Semitic. And then, throughout the rest of my adult life, just a initially gradual and then increasing, especially with the advent of social media, an increasing, spiraling, snowballing, toxic ball of hate that almost no Jew can seem to sidestep at the moment. It bears out in the numbers. The FBI reports that even though Jewish Americans account for just over 2% of the U.S. population, we are victims of 63% of reported religiously motivated hate crimes. And that's a staggering figure. The Anti-Defamation League's 2022 audit of anti-Semitic incidents tracked 3,697 anti-Semitic acts in the U.S., which is a 36% increase from 2021, and the largest number on record since the ADL began tracking anti-Semitic incidents in 1979. Which is why I was so glad is not the right word, heartened, that the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law made it a priority to have this event, to make sure that we brought staff from my colleagues together, because really this is going to take all of us to combat this hatred. And we have to look at every act of hate and every hate movement as when there's an act of hate against one, it's an act of hate against all. And the scale of this crisis and its intense acceleration really demands far more from all of us than we've been committing to. Too many in our community are afraid to display that they're Jewish online or in real life. College students, many fear wearing a yarmulke to class, and our neighbors are removing their mezuzahs from their doors so that they can avoid having the swastikas scrawled on their sidewalks or their driveways or their playgrounds or their houses defaced. When we witness so many horrific anti-Semitic incidents, fear and anxiety pervade our schools, community centers, and houses of worship. I know my own daughters and even I, from time to time, have said, gosh, should I wear my Star of David to this event today? Should I wear that T-shirt that expresses my Jewish pride? So we must fight back, we can fight back, and one of the most effective ways to combat this hate is through education and awareness. That's what Jewish American Heritage Month is all about, and it's demonstrated by this event today, and a thread tying all modern forms of anti-Semitism, including on college campuses and at work, is the spread of online hate. One tragic example from the U.S. in 2018, obviously, was the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, when a gunman burst into that synagogue, which I just had a chance to walk through just a few weeks ago, and killed brutally 11 worshippers. During his trial, prosecutors entered into evidence social media posts that the gunman made before his attack, where he called Jews the children of Satan and public enemy number one. He posted, liked, and shared a stream of anti-Semitic content, including an image that stated the only good Jew is a dead Jew. He engaged with anti-Semites online, and his anti-Semitic words turned deadly. These extremists, terror sympathizers, and neo-Nazis that were once combined to the deepest, darkest regions of the dark web are now trending on your front pages, whose reach doesn't abide by borders. And that's why I helped found the Interparliamentary Task Force to combat online anti-Semitism, where we work with legislators from around the world to combat the spread of anti-Semitism online, because that is what has triggered this precipitous rise of in-person hate and violence. We know that with advances in technology and social media reach, hate-filled rhetoric can cross international boundaries in record time. We sadly witness daily videos, tweets, memes, and especially platform comments, and increasingly tech-savvy generations arrive on campuses every year. So tackling online anti-Semitism is a critical component of our overall strategy to make college safer for Jews and other marginalized students. And I so appreciate the Brandeis Center's work in using the law to protect students and employees against civil rights violations. And I know your engagement with one of my staff, which was legendary before he became a staffer of mine. I was so proud of you for doing that. So this event will help us provide the tools and the resources that we can all bring back to our communities to continue to work to reverse the rise of hate and restore our freedom to move about safely without fear or anxiety. I am a fierce defender of the First Amendment in our country. I believe in the right to say things that are unpopular, that people don't like, that can even be painful. But there is a line, and it's a line that's been established in our law and judicial decisions where your speech being free stops at my nose, and you're not allowed to say anything you want if it's going to bring harm to someone else. That's a line that represents criminality, and it's one that we need to make sure is enforced. And so I don't shrink from being a fierce defender of the First Amendment, nor shrink from ensuring that your speech doesn't include the right to harm others, certainly not physically. And lastly, I'll just share this story with you, because lest you think that this is just some occasional random thing that happens that happens only in high-profile situations. There are one has only to look at social media feeds of so many of my colleagues, so many high-profile people, and see anti-Semitic content. But I'll share with you that my own children have suffered just the indignity of being my kid, and not just dealing with the criticism based on whatever position I took, but my own children had their bodies distorted in their pictures online, Zyklon gas cans in cartoon form pasted onto their images, horrific anti-Semitic accusations made towards them. And this happens to college students, high school students, all across America. And so we have to get at the problem of stopping the spread of hate, and the social media companies have to be held responsible for making sure that they are not having their algorithms intentionally and monetizing the spread of their algorithms to feed more hate to people who seek it, because the Tree of Life synagogue shootings, God forbid, will not be the last one we see if we don't do something about it. And that includes changing Section 230 so that you no longer treat these social media companies like the bulletin boards that they represented. They were nothing more than at the beginning when algorithms didn't exist. because now they certainly are responsible for that content. Thank you so much.
For your words, for what you shared with us, for hosting this and everything that you have been doing.
You're welcome. Thank you. I hope it's productive. Thank you so much.
Wow. So, I mean, I personally have faced death threats. I personally have had my image distorted in the neo-Nazi webosphere, but never in terms of close family members or children. So, I'm certainly moved by what the Congresswoman shared with us. Let me give you just a few issues, since I suspect that folks in this group are interested in issues. Number one, the use and compliance with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Some of you are familiar with this. All of you who've gone to college, to public high schools in the United States or public elementary schools have been protected by Title VI in the sense that it's the statute that protects students from discrimination based on race, color, or national origin, and yet for many years Jews were not protected up until 2004, based on the notion that Jews supposedly share only a religion and not a people. That was changed under my leadership at OCR, the Office for Civil Rights, in 2004, but it still was a battle until 2010, and it's a continuing battle because it exists now only as a policy within informal guidance and the Executive Order 13899 signed during the last administration. Under that statute, Jews are supposed to have the same protections in places like colleges and schools as other groups against discrimination. And yet it's often difficult to ensure compliance. OCR, the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, which I headed during 2 administrations, that agency receives approximately 10 to 15, and in some years 17,000 cases per year. Only a relatively small number of anti-Semitism cases, not because of the number of incidences are low. We've seen continually, including through some of the data that Congresswoman Schultz alluded to, that incidents are quite high. Jewish students are not always aware of the legal tools that they can use, don't always file, and when they do file, don't always get action from the federal government. During this particular administration, there has been only one formal resolution of a systemic campus anti-Semitism case, although we filed many of them. I'm pleased that that case involved one of our formal complaints at the University of Vermont. But with many complaints that are pending at OCR, it is unfortunate that this takes so long. This isn't just a matter of any one administration. I won't say that when I headed the agency I was perfect, but I do think it is important for agency officials to understand that anti-Semitism remains as much of a priority as any other form of discrimination to the American people and their representatives in Congress. There shouldn't be a situation where there's only one resolution during an administration. We would like to see better action. Now, not every allegation is valid. Not every allegation is supported sufficiently by evidence. Agencies need to conduct appropriate investigations, but those investigations should be done with appropriate speed. Justice delayed is justice denied. When cases sit for years on desks, it means that students end up leaving the schools that they were in, and schools end up perpetuating the problems. With the school year starting now, the anti-Semitism cases, for the most part, filed last year have not been resolved, and that means that schools have not been fixing the problems that were identified last year or the year before. That's simply a matter of making sure that enforcement priorities are sufficiently even-handed so that anti-Semitism cases are dealt with like others. Second, how do we ensure that there's a policy that makes clear that all forms of anti-Semitism are addressed even-handedly, including those that address Israel in some way? There's an executive order 13899 from the prior administration still in effect, but not widely disseminated or publicized. It is mentioned in a recent guidance from my successor, Assistant Secretary Catherine Lehman. To her credit, on the same day that the Biden National Strategy on Anti-Semitism was issued, she issued a Dear Colleague letter which mentioned the guidance from OCR on 13899. What is 13899? It is an executive order which says, first, that Jews get protections under Title VI just like any other ethno-religious groups. fact that Jews have not only ethnic commonalities, but also a religion shouldn't mean that they get less protection than any other group. So first, Jews get the same protection as everyone else. Second, in appropriate circumstances consistent with the First Amendment, when there is an allegation of anti-Semitism, and one needs to know whether conduct, not speech, conduct has been motivated by anti-Semitic animus. Agency officials should use the same definition of anti-Semitism that's used by the U.S. State Department, that's used by over 30 countries around the world, that has been embraced by several presidential administrations of both parties, including the Biden administration, and that is the so-called IRA, working definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. That's critical because it really is the one internationally recognized standard for determining which forms of activity are truly anti-Semitic and which are not. We have now an executive order in place, and an executive order isn't necessarily going to be followed by every administration. For the last few years, there have been promises from the last administration, but also from this administration, to issue formal regulations administering Executive Order 13899, the order on combating anti-Semitism. But every 6 months to a year, the promise is delayed. So for instance, the deadline was last December, and it was extended until this coming December, and no mention of it was made in the Biden national strategy. It is absolutely critical that the Biden administration do as it has promised, which is to say, issue the implementing regulations which it has notified the American people that it would issue through the OIRA, the Office of Management and Budget's regulatory arms, unified agenda and regulatory plan. So it is up on the regulatory plan, as it has been now for over 3 years. At some point, there needs to be action on it. 3, Middle East Studies programs. It is sadly true that Congress's plan to support Middle East Studies programs intended all the way back from the Cold War to provide a pipeline of linguistically competent potential national security officials who could speak Arabic, Farsi, and other Middle Eastern languages, has been misused in many cases to provide a biased anti-Israel agenda. Thanks to Congressional reauthorization a few years ago, there's now a requirement that Middle East Studies programs have a diversity of viewpoints and a balance of perspectives. And yet that is very seldom actually used, except in lip service. There will be a diversity of disciplinary backgrounds. Maybe the Middle East Studies programs will have political scientists, economists, and anthropologists, all of whom are anti-Israel. And it matters. It matters. There's a Middle East Studies program at the University of Pennsylvania, a recent former recipient of these funds, which is planned for later in this month, was scheduled to be mandatory for all students. That may be changing under public pressure, in which several speakers have been invited who are known for their anti-Semitic sentiments. We shouldn't censor people in higher education, but if universities pledge under federal law that they will have a diversity of perspectives and a balance of views, they should do what they are committed to do. And even if they don't do that, for goodness sake, they should have the decency as universities to have a provision of knowledge which does not generate into hate or bias. One last thing I'm going to mention for you. This isn't campus, it's K-12, but I'll say that just last week, you might have read, the Brandeis Center teamed up with the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and Stand With Us to file a lawsuit against the Santa Ana Unified School District in California. Why? Because that school district was considering the use of a controversial so-called liberated ethnic studies program, which the Jewish community had argued contained anti-Semitic content. And rather than showing the content and having a public discussion of it, much was done in secret. And according to documents that have been disclosed, there have been comments about the Jewish question, how to handle the Jewish question, not by eliminating anti-Semitic content, but by handling the Jews and not providing public disclosures. So we're seeking public disclosure, and ideally, for school districts which purport to be providing ethnic studies in order to help facilitate harmony among ethnic groups, not to make the situation worse by actually trafficking and stereotypes against any minority group. That's higher education in K-12 in a real quick nutshell. Corporate is an important issue to us as well, based on the reports that we are increasingly getting from people in the workplace. They are facing problems as well. And on that initiative, I couldn't be more pleased than to introduce our Corporate Initiatives Director, former New York State Assembly, former City Councilman, my colleague, Rory.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Ken said, I used to be in the State Assembly and the City Council in New York, and so the concept of catching a free lunch and maybe some interesting conversation is not new to me. I hope that you're enjoying your lunch, and I hope that you're finding the conversation interesting, because it is important. These are important issues, and we're here because we think that you have an important role in your offices in making sure that these issues are understood, both when you and members of Congress have to consider votes and changes to policy, but also as you have constituents reaching out with problems that they might be experiencing on campus or in the workplace. We want you to be able to think about these issues in a way that's going to be helpful and constructive for them and for you. A recent study of Jewish employees in the workplace found that over half of Jewish employees in the United States experienced anti-Semitism in the workplace. This is a very serious issue. It becomes very difficult for someone in the workplace to report anti-Semitism, to confront anti-Semitism, because most workers, unless they're protected by a collective bargaining agreement, have very few rights in the workplace. So it's a problem that goes, if anything, underreported and under-addressed. I want to talk about three different kinds of anti-Semitism that we are seeing in the workplace, and the role that the Brandeis Center plays and that your office can play as us civil rights lawyers. That's how we approach these issues, and you as policymakers and people who help your constituents. First is the issue of religious accommodations in the workplace. If someone's religious beliefs require an accommodation in terms of the hours that they work, the days that they work, the attire that they wear, a recent Supreme Court decision just this past June dramatically expanded the responsibilities of employers to accommodate their workers' religious needs. In the past, if an employee went to a supervisor and said, listen, I need to take off for the Jewish holiday Rosh Hashanah, which is in a few days, or Yom Kippur, or I had a death in my family and I need to sit Shiva, which is a 7-day period of mourning that religious Jews observe. If that burdened the employer by anything more than the minimum de minimis amount, the employer could say, listen, sorry, can't accommodate you. The Supreme Court, in unanimous decision this past June, ruled that employers do have to accommodate their workers unless the employer can show that the imposition, the burden, is a substantial one. So if you are a Jewish employee, or you have worked with Jewish colleagues, or you have a constituent that calls you up and says that, hey, I'm trying to take off and I can't, or I'm trying to do X, Y, Z and they're not letting me, be aware that right now, the burden has shifted in a very significant way to employers to justify denying that opportunity, that accommodation. The second relates to an issue that Ken brought up. And Ken, I don't know if you were clear, but Ken had been the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights in the Department of Education. When he mentions the Office for Civil Rights, he ran that office. The issue of diversity, equity, inclusion programs in the workplace. These are very, very important programs that help to identify racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, you name it, in the workplace. But we are seeing very often that they erase that these programs and the training that they do in the events that they sponsor, in the mentorship that they offer, they erase the experience of their Jewish employees and the anti-Semitism that exists both in the world and in the workplace. It's very important, you as mostly young professionals, understand, both for yourselves and for the offices that you work in, that Jewish employees experience anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism exists in the workplace, and where you have efforts to ensure that your diverse workplace, that your workplace is diverse, and that your diverse workplace is attending to the particular needs of each of your employees, that has to include your Jewish employees as well. That might mean, yes, you ought to celebrate Jewish Heritage Month alongside the celebration of other identities month. But it also means that if you have a mentorship program, or if you are doing a training on ism in the workplace, you need to include anti-Semitism and the understanding of the uniqueness of anti-Semitism in that conversation. And then here's the third one, and it's the most interesting and the most challenging, and that is the ability of Jewish employees who care deeply about the state of Israel, the land of Israel, to be able to express themselves in the workplace to the extent that that kind of expression is allowed at all, and to not be harassed, intimidated, discriminated against because of their deeply held belief as a Jewish person that the state of Israel is important to them. You know, we have a slew of Jewish holidays coming up. Where are you all from? Is anyone from New York? Okay, good. New York City? Upstate? Where?
Long Island.
All right, I was Queens, Long Island. Now, I was in Queens and Great Neck.
Okay.
It's still difficult to say I'm from Long Island. It's still New York City. But I'm asking because if you live in a population or an area where there's a large Jewish community, you know that we've got a lot of holidays coming up. Almost all of them, some way, shape, or form, involved, centered around, focused on Israel. It's not a political statement. It's a matter of a person's identity. So whatever your views are on the politics of Israel, doesn't matter. I don't care. That's not the issue. But it will be, I'm telling you that an employer puts themselves in legal jeopardy when they do not allow Jewish employees to express their support for the state of Israel, or where they allow other employees to make their Jewish employees uncomfortable about their connection to the state of Israel. So those are three areas that we see a lot of legal anti-Semitism activity happening. In providing religious accommodations in the workplace, in ensuring that DEI programs include the Jewish experience, for want of a better term, and the issue of Israel in the workplace. Look, it's our hope that after you leave here, well-fed and ready for, the coming session, that you look at the Brandeis Center as a resource. We are an organization of lawyers. We are a civil rights organization. There are many wonderful Jewish communal organizations that your offices probably deal with. Think of us if you need help on legal issues relating to your constituents' needs, legal questions regarding policy issues that you might be confronted with, or if you need research on an issue that you haven't confronted before. That's why we're here this afternoon. We hope to be able to work with you in the future. Thank you very much.
If you happen to have any questions, we're here. We've got some time. If you don't, that's okay too. But are there any questions? Yes.
My name is Eric Rosen, and I was on the Virginia Commission to Combat Anti-Semitism last year. And one of the things that occurred during that time was that a grassroots parents organization called United Against Anti-Semitism in Northern Virginia, Fairfax County, filed a Title VI complaint against Fairfax County Public Schools for a pattern of being unable or unwilling to deal with anti-Semitic incidents in the schools by students, by faculty, by administrators, sometimes more through indifference or even inability to understand the problem. My question is this: when these parents went to the school administrators, including senior superintendent, senior officials, they found there was a difficulty in making their complaint in the context of DEI, because in a system in which some staff may see Jews as white adjacent,